So welcome to everybody for this, our fourth talk of this series, and it's the first one that we can legitimately call the winter series, I think, given the recent weather. And we're delighted to introduce Kenny Kortland from Forestry and Land Scotland to be with us tonight. And Kenny's been with Forestry and Land Scotland and before that the Forestry Commission since 2008, working as an ecologist. He's also an honorary senior lecturer at Aberdeen University, and he's also previously worked with RSPB, so he's well versed in the subject matter that we're going to be discussing tonight, and he's going to be sharing with us the work of the Cairngorms Connect Predator project, which I think is a really important initiative that we've got going on and around some aspects of our wildlife and ecology, which are very sensitive, very significant and important, but also can be quite contentious and controversial. So it's good that we are building an evidence base through some thorough research work in order to inform the decisions that are made. So I'm looking forward to this evening's talk very much. And so I'd just like to welcome Kenny and hand over to you for the evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. Gee, that intro made me sound like I know what I'm talking about, so I hope I do it justice. Okay, so my name's Kenny Kortland. I work for Forestry and Land Scotland, as Mike said, and tonight I'm going to tell you about the Cairngorms Connect Predator project. So thank you all for coming out to listen to this. So the Cairngorms Connect project, there's lots of logos in this talk, by the way, because that's the way of things nowadays, is a partnership that involves Forestry and Land Scotland, RSPB, Wildland, which is the privately owned Glenfeshie estate, etc., and Nature Scot. Those are the main landowning partners in the Cairngorms Connect partnership. And along the bottom are some of the funding bodies that fund some of the work I'm going to talk about tonight. So for those of you who are not familiar with the area, this is the land ownership that's in the Cairngorms Connect area. So the light blue is RSPB, the green is FLS, the pink is Nature Scot, formerly SNH, and the blue is the privately owned land of Wildland down in the southern end of the area. It's about 600 square kilometres of land, and the primary aim, as you'll see in the next photograph, is ecological restoration. You can see here in Glenfeshie, you've got the braided channel there that's working away naturally. You can see all the tree regeneration that's happening now, and by virtue of the deer control that's happening. So that's the main aim of the Cairngorms Connect initiative. So within the area, there's about 5,000 species being recorded, and that's mainly due to the conscientiousness of RSPB at Abernethy over the years, recording species. And so it includes 11 species of breeding raptors now, including this one here, the white-tailed eagle. Approximately 55 people are involved working in the initiative, so it's about people too, and people are encouraged to come and visit the area. So it's not some sort of exclusive conservation club. It's a forward-looking, modern-thinking approach to land management, I think is the best way to describe it. So tonight I'm going to talk about one particular aspect of the Cairngorms Connect initiative, and that's the Predator project. So the aims of the project are outlined there, and you can go on the website and there's a page on the Cairngorms Connect website about the Predator project, and you can find out a bit more about it. So you don't have to read all this text. Tonight I'm going to talk about two particular aspects there in bold. The things I'm going to talk about are the aim to try and find out what the predators are eating, and to find out if predators eat other predators, because there's a lot of talk in rewilding circles that if the predators reconvene, come together on an ecosystem, everything balances out. You hear this word balance quite a lot. So we wanted to start off the project looking at some of the fundamental, trying to gather some of the fundamental info about these animals that are returning to the area. We started in 2017, and basically we're working on a shoestring with students, and Xavier Lambin from Aberdeen Uni, you see there, him and I started this off, and we've got various other people involved. It's not really a mainstream part of my job. I sort of do it on the edge of my desk, and my bosses are looking at it, wondering what the heck I'm doing. But it's really interesting. I think it's quite important, so we're managing to get by. Okay, but I thought I would take a wee step back. When I was putting this talk together yesterday and today, I had a think about why we're doing it. I mean, I suppose it started off because we were interested and we're seeing these various predators returning to the Cairngorms Connect area. It made me think, why are we studying mammals? And I saw some interesting facts and figures in the media recently, and this one was absolutely terrifying. So you can see now, in terms of the biomass, the physical weight of mammals on Earth, 60% is now livestock, 36% is us, and only 4% of the biomass, the weight of mammals on planet Earth now, is actually mammals. A pretty terrifying statistic. And basically, it seems there's been an 86% reduction in the biomass of mammals on Earth in, not more than our lifetimes, really. So really quite shocking. So we really are in a biodiversity crisis. And studying mammals, as hopefully I'll demonstrate tonight, is quite an important thing to do in that context of this worldwide global problem. So why study mammalian predators? Well, firstly, they're in a lot of trouble. So here's some a range of predators in the table on the right. I don't know if you can read that or not. I can't read it here on this screen because I don't have my glasses. But many of the animals and mammals, predatory mammals that we're familiar with on David Attenborough programs, etc., are in dire trouble and declining greatly. So you can see there that lions have lost 95% of their ranges, and I can't actually read it. But many of these familiar animals are in dire straits and probably going to go extinct, some of these, in the lifetime of my children, which is quite a shocking legacy for us to leave. But there's another reason why it's important to study mammals and understand more about predatory mammals. And that's because they exert what's called a top-down effect on ecosystems, as illustrated beautifully by these two diagrams. So the one on the left there is not dissimilar to our system here. It includes many of the mammals and bird species that we have. And what happens is that the presence of top predators has an effect on the lower trophic levels, as they're called, and something called a trophic cascade happens. So the direct and indirect impacts of having predators in the system has a profound effect on the structure of ecological communities. And essentially, the general pattern appears to be that large apex predators, like wolves and lynx in this case, enhance biodiversity at lower levels by controlling these middle-sized predators called mesopredators, because foxes and lynx in this case will control foxes and martens, etc., and would allow species at lower trophic levels to be more abundant. So that's the general thinking in this area now, that actually predators are much more important than we had formerly realized in structuring ecological communities and facilitating biodiversity. Because previously, conventionally ecological thought believed that the structure of communities was determined almost entirely by bottom-up processes. So basically, how much grass was there, how much food was there, and everything else flowed from that. But a growing body of research indicates now it's not only bottom-up, but top-down control by predators. So when you remove all these predators from around the world, as we're doing, this has profound negative implications for ecosystems. But of course, in this part of the world, we don't have these species anymore, so they don't control foxes and martens. And what we have in this area, as I'm increasingly focusing in now on Strathspey, is we have a lot of badgers, and we're a bit uncertain about the impact they have. So currently, the Cairngorms Connect Predator Project is studying that group of animals on the left there. So we have lots of mesopredators. They're not controlled by anything apart from man in some places. So they are appearing to achieve quite high densities, and presumably this is having big impacts on other species lower down in the trophic chains, some of which we're interested in, like Capercaillie. So tonight I've included quite a bit about Capercaillie, given that I was aware that some people in the audience were interested in capers, so I thought I would include some of that in this talk. The picture on the right is quite interesting because white-tailed eagles have returned to parts of Finland, and the coastal parts of the Finnish archipelago have been overrun by American mink, which has had a seriously big impact negatively on some of the shore nesting birds. And they're finding that the return of the sea eagle is causing the mink to change its behavior. So not only is the sea eagle eating some of the mink and hopefully going to reduce the population of mink, but it's probably more importantly making the mink think very carefully about where it hunts. So it's avoiding areas now where it might be exposed, which is allowing some of the seabirds and shore nesting birds to recover. So that's another example of this profound effect that top predators can have on lower trophic levels and the biodiversity in an area. Okay, so this is the logo for the Cairngorms Connect Predator Project. And as I've said, what we observed about from 15 years ago, that some predator species were starting to return to FLS land, and that's how I initially got the idea of this predator project. So this exaggerated graphic is just to illustrate some of the things that we're now observing about predators having an influence on other predators. Clearly, all these predators are going to have an impact on the prey species we're interested in, like Capercaillie, but they also have an effect on each other. So we've got data now on goshawks taking jays, on golden eagles taking foxes, and on martens taking pine martens. We don't yet know how significant these are in terms of the beneficial impact for species like Capercaillie, etc., but we're beginning to learn. The one thing we're sure about is the system's now becoming a lot more complex than it was even 20 years ago. So a lot of the work that I'm going to describe today is of two of my students, Jack and Christian, and they work mainly in the forest areas so far. And this is the sort of scene you'll see on FLS land. We've got a huge amount of prey, lots of voles, foxes, badgers, pine martens, all of which seem to be increasing in the last couple of decades. And organisations like the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, to see Kathy Fletcher's in the audience tonight, they've collected some good information on increases in things like martens and foxes over the years. So we're pretty sure that these predators are increasing, but also we've seen a return on many of the avian predators to the area. So there's quite an interesting system going on, reconvening of the ecological community there. And this is what we're interested in studying. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the work of Christian Navarro. He's a PhD student that Xavier Lambin and I supervise. And he essentially wanted to find out what foxes and pine martens were eating, essentially. That's the nub of his PhD, and what the implications of their diet is. Because those of us involved in Capercaillie conservation have discussed long and hard the relative importance of predation and other factors in the decline of Capercaillie. So finding out some fundamental info about what foxes and martens were eating would be really interesting in that regard. So given Christian's just one student and given our lack of funding, really, we thought we'd look at a subset of the species in the Cairngorms Connect area. So this is a diagram of Christian's study and what he was looking at and the interactions among these animals. So what did he do? So but in 2018 and 2019, he's currently just finishing writing up at the minute, and he's kindly agreed to allow me to show some of his data tonight. So we collected information on deer management, how many deer were killed and how much gralichs were put into the system. That's the entrails, etc., that are left after a deer is culled. We did scat surveys. We collected droppings of foxes and martens. We did extensive camera trapping and hair trapping for DNA. We did let counts, Capercaillie mainly. And we counted field voles and bank voles because we thought they'd be important drivers in the system. So I'll tell you some of the results that Christian and us collected over those 2 years. So the first thing we looked at was the intensity of deer management. We quantified all that because we figured out there's a huge subsidy, as it's called, going into the system. And we calculated that annually there's about 3 tons of gralich being put into the system that is free food for martens and foxes. So perhaps this subsidy is elevating the populations of these animals with negative consequences for things like Capercaillie. And this is an intensity map there that shows you where the culling was happening. So the brighter the colour, the more of the culling, and the more of this gralis was going into the system. So that's something we had to account for. Christian collected a lot of fox and marten scats. In fact, he collected over the 2 years 3,777 scats with help of some volunteers. Maybe some of them are in the audience tonight, I'm not sure. From those scats, we analysed 647 fox scats and 1,060 marten scats. And these were analysed using something called meta-barcoding, which I'll go on to try to explain in the next slide. It's basically a genetic method. It's the latest thing. It's quite expensive, so we could only afford to look at the diet, look at vertebrates in the diet. So we couldn't look at insects or worms or anything because we couldn't afford to do that. So we only looked at vertebrates in the diet, but that's mainly what we were interested in. So what is meta-barcoding? Is it genetic magic? Well, essentially what you do is you collect the droppings, you take them back to the laboratory, you take a sample, you extract the DNA, you amplify the DNA, which is the amazing bit as far as to my mind. So essentially you get fragments of the DNA and then chemically you increase it by putting in the basic constituents of DNA and mix it up in this incredible machine that I don't quite understand, but that magnifies the amount of DNA so you can start investigating it in a bit more detail. If there's any geneticists in the audience, feel free to correct me. Once you've amplified it, you made your sample bigger and more easy to examine, really, is the clever bit of meta-barcoding. You take that DNA and you run it through this new system where the sequences are compared, the genetic sequences that you've amplified are compared against a library, a database of DNA sequences for a whole range of prey species. And from that, you can tell what an animal's been eating. So in plain English, you take a dropping, you subject it to this process, and you can tell what that animal has been eating in the previous day or two. And generally we found that for foxes and martens, they had 1 or 2 prey items, maybe 3 or 4 exceptionally, in a given scat. So I've probably done a very poor job at explaining that, mainly because I don't really understand it. But it's a genetic method that can tell you what an animal's been eating. I should have just said that at the beginning. Okay, we also measured field voles and bank voles, and this was really interesting because in places like Scandinavia, where lots of research has been done on predators and prey, the populations of field voles cycle hugely. They go up and down on a regular basis, 5-year cycle or whatever. And this drives the predator community. Owls eat lots of voles in 1 year and then become abundant, and the vole population crashes and the owls decline and start feeding on other things. A whole huge number of scientists have tried to understand these processes for a long time. So we're just at the beginning of this in the Cairngorms Connect Predator Project. But what we found is already that the vole populations cycle quite a lot. So you don't really have to worry about the graphs too much. It's just mainly for me to remember what I'm saying. But what we found is that at the low point of the vole cycle on the left-hand graph there were about 20 to 30 field voles in a hectare of clear fell or grassy area. And that went up to about 120 field voles per hectare just a couple of years later. So that's the scale at which they increase. So you can imagine that's got big implications for things like foxes and martens. And the interesting thing was that during Christian's study, it became apparent that he was carrying out his work whilst the voles were at a low ebb. So that's quite an interesting point. There weren't many voles around whilst we were studying the diet of these 2 predators. It's worth bearing that in mind. Okay, so what did the meta-barcoding tell us about what Mr. Fox and Mr. Marten were eating? Essentially, they're both specialists in field voles. Even during the low period, the pine marten continued to focus on field voles, presumably expending more energy to get the same number of voles it would in a peak of the vole cycle. The fox was also a vole specialist, as you can see in the bottom graph here. The left-hand side the graph indicates the frequency of occurrence of these prey species in dropping. So in the case of the left-hand graph, which is really tiny on here, so I have to look there, about 60% of fox and marten scats had evidence of had evidence of voles in them. So this was by far and away the main prey item for both species, even at this low point in this cycle. For foxes, their alternative prey was mainly deer gralloch, as you can see in the graph on the right there. And pine martens, their alternative prey was shrews and amphibians. And the shrews is an interesting one because conventionally naturalists believe that predatory mammals didn't eat shrews because they were distasteful, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. And you can see in the bottom graph there that pine martens have a more diverse diet. They eat a wider range of things, which is another obvious finding. So in a nutshell, they're both field vole specialists. So you can see here, I'm presenting all the data that Christian has collected, and these graphs are slightly different. These mean RRA means relative reed abundance. So what proportion of all the genetic reeds were of these species? So just think of it as a relative comparison of the importance of the various prey items in the diet. So the top left-hand graph confirms that in all 4 seasons, winter, spring in 18 and 19, field voles were important. The rodents were important for martens. But you can see also in the top right there, they ate a range of songbirds, wrens, robins, warblers, particularly in spring. So the light-colored bars are springtime, and in 2019, the voles were particularly low. So the martens appear to switch a wee bit to eating songbirds. But you can see there only about 5% at most of the reeds were of songbirds, but it was a component of their diet. Did that move on there? Yeah, it did. Okay, so the same set of graphs for martens. I'm just showing these for sake of being comprehensive so everybody can see all the data that we've collected. We don't want anybody to think we're kind of squirreling away information and not sharing it. So you can see the same picture emerges through the seasons for foxes in the top left there. Rodents are crucially important. They eat other things. The bottom middle graph, they eat quite a few shrews. They even eat some moles. They eat a lot of deer carrion, as you can see in the middle top graph. Some hares, the bottom right, and a range of bird species. Galliforms are things like grouse, etc., in the bottom left. So they eat a fair bit of red grouse and some other species that I'll come on to in a moment or two. But the top right-hand graph there is quite interesting, and I'll zoom in on that now. So in the droppings of foxes, we found lots of evidence of dog DNA. Does anybody want to hazard a guess how that would come about?
Feeding on other cubs.
No, this is domestic dog DNA, Canis familiaris, I think is the Latin name. Yeah, they're eating dog poo. So it took us a while to figure this out, but then it was really obvious once we did figure it out. What's happening is there's tons of dog walkers now. You probably know that the number of visitors to the park is increasing dramatically, and there's lots and lots of dog walkers going about, and dogs do their business. And we thought, well, that's really distasteful. Why on earth would you eat dog poo? But then we thought, well, lots of pet dogs eat dog poo and get a row for it. We thought about it a bit more. We sent Christian out to collect some dog poo. He wasn't very happy. Took it back to the lab and put it in this machine that measures the calories in something and basically burns it and measures the energy that comes off of it. And what we found is that in your average pet dog poo, there's almost as many calories as in a Mars bar. So if you're a fox and you're running about the forest on these tracks, you're coming across these snacks everywhere, and the snacks don't fight back and they're full of calories, it makes perfect sense. So that was a bit of a surprise, but it's a really significant part of the fox diet, it would appear. Okay, so I mentioned that one of the aims of the project was to try and determine whether or not the predators ate other predators. So we wanted to see if foxes preyed on pine martens, because it's known from elsewhere, but there's not really that much data on it, and nobody's really got a good handle on how significant it is in ecological terms. So I'll now tell you what we've found so far. We found 4 separate, in the meta-barcoding and the genetic evidence, we found 4 events of foxes maybe having killed and eaten, or found and eaten, but hopefully killed and eaten a pine marten. And these were all in Inchriach Forest, which is the FLS block in the southern end of Cairngorms Connect. We're not sure why it is solely in Inchriach. We're trying to get our heads around that. So if this is intraguild predation, as it's called, intraguild means another predator killing another predator within this guild of predators. If this is intraguild predation, but we'll never be 100% sure. It's conceivable that that's between 10 and 30% of the marten population in Inchriach. And in fact, from Scandinavian research, we know that foxes sometimes kill martens and don't eat them. So these 4 consumption events, which were separate in space and time, so we think they're separate events, they might be an underestimate of how many martens a fox is killing. Foxes are killing every year. So it's conceivable that having foxes around might have a negative effect on the marten population. And you might extrapolate from that could be beneficial for Capercaillie. But these are just very preliminary data, but it is interesting to confirm that it would appear that predation of one predator by another is happening in our system. Okay, so this is a summary of some of the information we've just talked about. And the reason I show this particular graph is to highlight this. You can see here that for both martens and foxes, they're eating galliforms, and in this case, it's Capercaillie. So we've confirmed that it's in the diet. We all kind of knew that from abundant anecdote, but for the purposes of this study, we've confirmed it. But we've also confirmed that for these species, martens and foxes, it's a really trivial part of their diet. But that's not to say it's not important for Capercaillie, particularly currently when capers appear to be declining again. So to give you some numbers, for pine martens, we found 15 detections in spring and 1 in winter of Capercaillie in their droppings. However, 9 of those 15 were clustered pretty close together in space and time. So it could have been one predation event appearing in several droppings. But worst case scenario, there were 15 martens, 15 Capercaillie consumed by martens across the 2 years, mainly in springtime, which suggests nests or young. And we all know from work by Ron Summers and others that, and Desmond in the audience here, that pine martens are key predators of Capercaillie nests. Foxes was quite surprising. We only found 4 detections of Capercaillie in the diet of foxes, and these were all in winter. And 3 out of these 4 were in a similar area, but let's assume worst case scenario that there are 4 separate predation events. And bearing in mind, of course, we're not sampling all the foxes and martens in the area. We're just sampling a proportion of them, we think. So that's the scale of what we found. They are definitely eating Capercaillie, but from the data we've collected, I mean, the study wasn't really designed to answer the question about the impact on Capercaillie, but there's such interest in it, we're trying to get Christian to think about it a bit more. We really did the study to find out the basics about what these animals were eating, but as you can see, we have found out that they do eat some Capercaillie. We've also got other information from the work we've been doing. I don't know if you can see that very well or not, but we've done tons of camera trapping in various places for various reasons. And there on the 4th of July this summer in Glenmore is a fox, and we think that's a pretty well-grown Capercaillie poult. It would fit size-wise. I can see Desmond looking at it, so I'll need to get people like Desmond, etc., to look at it. But various people are in agreement that this is an example of a fox eating a Capercaillie poult. There were broods in this area. So we've got various info now confirming what we all knew already, that foxes and martens do take capercaillies. And so it's legitimate to ask now, given that all these predators are increasing in number and they're coming back, it's all quite exciting ecologically, but it's legitimate to ask now, what are the implications of this new ecological state with all these returning predators for endangered prey species, which we are, subjectively interested in? The capercaillie is a spectacular bird. We all like it. It'd be a shame if it disappeared. So these questions are perfectly legitimate. So here's a dead capercaillie here. Can anybody tell me what's killed this bird? There's a prize.
Domestic cat.
No.
Hostility.
No. It's a trick question.
Collie dog.
No. It's quite an annoying.
Capercaillie.
Pardon?
Another capercaillie.
Yeah, exactly. Well done, Alan Bandick. Prize goes to Alan. I'll maybe buy you a decent fleece. This was a cock capper that was found on a lake at Glenmore a few years back. He was found lying like this, and another. They expend a lot of energy in lek season, displaying and mating and fighting, etc. And sometimes they get exhausted. I've seen myself a few times when one cock capper has managed to get on top of another exhausted one and peck it a bit, but I've never seen anything as extreme as this. So putting all the info together, although it wasn't observed directly, we're pretty sure this is what happened. This bird was killed by another capper. So apologies for that annoying trick question. So it is legitimate to ask what happens to these prey species when all these predators are returning, particularly as you all know, lots of us have expended lots of public money and effort trying to save the capercaillie, and it's a very popular bird. So we really need to start investigating it a bit more. And Christian's work is helpful in that regard, but doesn't provide definitive answers. So what's happened to capercaillie in Glenmore, Inchriach and Rothiemurchus, the FLS ownership area? Well, you can see that between 2002 and 2015, there was actually a spectacular increase in lek counts, and we were counting them with consistent effort every year. We in the years leading up to 2002, we spent a lot of effort trying to lek count, map where the leks were. And then from 2002 onwards, we've had a pretty consistent effort at counting them, involving the same people, and FLS staff and others, contractors are always reporting sightings. So I think you can rely on this portrayal of what's happened over the last 20 years or so as being quite reliable. And it's really fascinating because during this period, the wider context in Scotland was a massive decline in capercaillie. And also during this period was the time when lots of these predators recolonized the Cairngorms Connect area. So goshawks came back, eagles increased in number, foxes and martens were increasing, badgers apparently, all the keepers and FLS deerstalkers were telling us they were increasing dramatically. We were a bit skeptical to begin with, but we've changed our mind now. Anyway, something fascinating was going on. So up till 2015, I was saying things like, oh, there's not a problem. The predators and capercaillie are coexisting, no bother. So if you go back and look through various FLS press releases, you'll see me saying optimistic things like that. Subsequent to 2015, however, the population started going down. Now, grouse are notorious for going up and down, according to various influences and cycles of various duration. But we didn't count in 2020 because of COVID, obviously. So we weren't in the forest much. In 2021, Jack Bamber, the other student I'm going to talk about, started, and him and I were in the forest a lot. And I've got tons of notebooks about where cappers were, etc. So I was pretty shocked to find virtual disappearance of capercaillie from large parts of FLS land. And in fact, Desmond was working on lek counts for us in 21, was it Desmond, or 2019? And Desmond said the birds were a bit thin on the ground. So he was right, and it now seems to have got a lot worse. So I've been pretty shocked, actually. Having spent the last year, I've spent a lot of time in the forest and elsewhere in the Strath looking through my old notebooks and going to look for cappers where they used to be. There's hardly any birds around, it would seem. It's really quite shocking. So this This graph is slightly optimistic, in fact, because what happens is the females disappear rapidly. We observed this in other parts of Scotland when the birds became extinct. The females live for shorter periods of time. They're more vulnerable to predation, etc. They seem to vanish really rapidly. That appears to be what's happening. And because the males are longer lived, the lick counts look quite optimistic for a while, whereas the females are disappearing. And what's happening here is some of the young males are getting territories and licks, whereas previously they wouldn't, because all the older males would have been there. So the lick counts are sort of maintained and look quite optimistic. But meanwhile, the background story is the hen numbers are plummeting down. That's my personal observations lately anyway, and other people seem to think the same. So it's quite a worrying thing that's going on. So given that, and given that we know there's a lot more predators about, it would seem, we thought we would see if diversionary feeding can reduce Capercaillie predation. So diversionary feeding is basically what it says there. You provide the predators with food at key times to try and divert them from things that you're interested in, like Capercaillie. And the inspiration for doing this was from a guy called Per Vegge in Norway, who's been doing this for quite a long time, and found that if he provided diversionary food for foxes and martins for a short period each year during the nesting and chick period for Capercaillies, it actually elevated the productivity, the breeding success of cappers and black grouse by a fair margin. So we thought we would try it over here. The key point is that you only provide this diversionary food for about 8 weeks. So it's a short period of time, too short, we think, to increase the numbers of foxes and martins, but provided that the food is provided at this key time to try and get them away from looking for and eating Capercaillies. So you provide them with enough food to satisfy them, to deter them from hunting. So we've got another PhD student that Xavier and I are supervising. He's a really nice lad called Jack Bamber, hard-working guy. So he's been working away, and I'll now tell you what he's found. He's only just completed his first year, his first field season. So what did he do? So he created 30 food dumps scattered through the Cairngorms Connect area. He had 30 food dumps and 30 control sites, and these were scattered in pairs, a food site and a site that wasn't fed, a control site, and there was 30 of these combinations scattered through randomly through the Cairngorms Connect area in the forest. So he put out food on a weekly basis to these food dumps. We had camera traps on there, and we've got, well, I'll show you there's some images there of all the predators we've been talking about, foxes, pine martins, and badgers, and other things like white-tailed eagles have shown up. But the big surprise for me, and people like Frank and Ewan and Desmond in the audience here, and Bobby Innes at Glenmore have been sort of telling us this for a while, but because I've not been working on it myself, I was a bit uncertain, but the number of badgers in the forest appears to have increased dramatically. And now I've got my eye in for them. And now we've had cameras everywhere for a couple of years now. We found that badgers are distributed all through the forest. It's quite incredible. And I thought, well, did I miss them previously? But I don't think I did, because I'm sure I would have seen the signs. Because if you go to some parts of Glenmore and Inshriach, the signs of badgers all over the place. Previously, I was aware of them on the edge of the forest, mainly foraging on farmland, we always thought, and occasionally coming in the forest. And now there's sets scattered throughout the land holding of FLS, certainly. I'm less certain about the other ownerships. So this seems to have been a real change in the last 20 years. It confirms what the other guys have been saying about other parts of Strathspey. And it was a real surprise. So we've got lots of pictures of badgers at these food dumps as well. We can discuss the reasons for the increase later if you want to do so. So here's some of Jack's data. And in fact, this image here of a food dump, there's actually a hen capper there with a cock and a hen poked on the left-hand side there that he happened to photograph on the 3rd of September. So he put out over 1.5 tons of deer remains over this 8-week period at these 30 food dumps, and about 50 kilograms of food was disappearing from each dump every week. It's quite remarkable. 25 of the 30 food dumps were used. And that really surprised me. I thought they'd all be used. 5 of them were not used by foxes, martens, or badgers. And we couldn't, no idea why that is. We would think they would all home in on them, no problem. But 5 went unused, which was a real surprise. But we got over 37,000 camera trap images, which Jack has been looking through over the last wee while. And in terms of the proportion of the photographs, the most common animal photographed was badgers, then foxes, and pine martens were surprisingly the least common, given we think they're probably one of the most abundant, certainly more abundant than foxes, probably less abundant than badgers now, I would guess. But they only comprise 33% of the photographs. And we think that's because they probably avoid the food dumps where badgers and foxes are dominating them, because we've done another piece of work with another student that showed that martens avoid these other predators in space and time. So they seem to be aware of where these other animals are. They see them, they can smell them, and they plan their foraging routes, and they're wandering to try and avoid these other bigger predators. So that might explain why we've got relatively few martens photographed at these food dumps. Okay, so in addition to the food dumps, we needed to get some sort of measure of whether providing the food was useful in any way or not. So what Jack did was he created a load of artificial nests. So on the left, you can see a real capper nest. On the right is his attempt at creating an artificial nest. And he made 360 of these artificial nests. So you can see he was quite busy this summer. And these were distributed around the food sites and the control sites. So we compare the levels of artificial nests that were eaten in places where the predators were fed and places where they weren't fed. So we had 180 instances where the nests were eaten. So that's half exactly, isn't it? Yeah. So half the nests were eaten, basically. So we wanted to identify who was doing that, obviously. So we only had a limited number of camera traps, so we put those in a proportion of the nest. So looking at the camera trap data at who ate the nests, and that was on 46 occasions we had camera trap evidence. Martens accounted for 75% of the nests that were eaten. Badgers, surprisingly, only 14.5%, and foxes only 2%. If we use camera traps plus an interpretation of the signs that we found there, so if it was wrecked and torn apart, we could be pretty sure it was a badger, for example. That was the full 180 predation events. And the proportions were pretty similar. We were quite pleased with that because it suggested that our attempts to interpret what was doing it were fairly accurate. So the overall finding in the first year is that substantially fewer nests that were near food dumps were predated compared to areas that didn't have food dumps. So it's quite encouraging and is in line with what Per Wegge found in some ways, is that if you provide this diversionary feeding, it reduces predation, certainly on artificial nests. And from that, you would hope it would be the same for the nests of wild birds, but you can never be 100% sure, because there are various biases associated with artificial nests. But anyway, it's an encouraging finding. And in graphical form, it looks like this. So along the bottom here is the time from the setting up the artificial nest. And up the side there is the likelihood that the nest is going to be still around at this given time period. So if you just look at after say 26 days, I think it is there, you can see that the pink nests, the ones that are in areas that don't have a food dump, are far less likely to have survived the nests that are close to a food dump. So that's that previous result in a graphical form. So the first year of Jack's fieldwork is quite encouraging in terms of diversionary feeding being a non-lethal way to try and control predation pressure on Capercaillie. That's not saying anything about the merits or otherwise of predator control. It's just us looking at this particular form of trying to mitigate predation. Ideally, we'd want to be able to measure the benefits of this method, diversionary feeding, on the wild population of Capercaillie. And traditionally, that was done using a pointer dog and going out in the breeding season, the brood season, and counting broods and the number of chicks, and you would then get the chicks per hen, and that was your measure. But various people, including a fair few FLS staff, the organisation I work for, are concerned about disturbance from pointing dogs. And they say to me, it's a bit hypocritical for us to tell people not to disturb Capercaillies and keep their dogs on leads when you're going about the forest with lots of dogs. So I found it difficult to argue against that, and so we agreed to stop using pointer dogs. So we're trying to find an alternative method. So we've been trying to put, we have been putting camera traps on what are called dust baths. So the Capercaillies frequently go into these dust baths, and they spread the dust all around their bodies, and this gets rid of external parasites. And we thought this might be a way to get a handle on how well the Capercaillies are breeding in any one year. And actually, it's been surprisingly quite good. The trouble is now there's so few broods about that I think if we'd done this 5 years ago, it would have been far more successful. But we're struggling to get a big enough sample size because I simply think there's so few birds about. But I'll show you some of the photographs that Jack and the rest of us have collected using camera traps at dust baths in another location. So here's one from the 15th of June this year. You can see the female Capercaillie on the left there. You can see in the middle of the dust bath, there are 5 chicks there, but there's actually 8 because there's 3 other ones there. So this hen early on in June had 8 chicks in this area, which was good news. And we noticed something really interesting in the behavior in all the photographs. What happens is the female approaches a dust bath with the chicks behind her, and she goes into the dust bath and does her dust bathing, and the chicks all stand around watching her, presumably learning. She finishes, she walks out slowly, and only then do the chicks go in. And this pattern was repeated in all the broods that we managed to get pictures of. So Jack's managed to get some really interesting behavioural insights here, things that weren't known before as far as I know. And he's submitted a paper, a wee short ecology note around this. So it's really quite interesting and neat. So this offers potential as a sort of non-invasive, non-disturbing way of monitoring Capercaillie productivity. I think if the birds were abundant, like they were even 10 years ago, more abundant, you could be pretty sure that this would be useful. But as I said twice already, there's so few birds around now that I think we've left it a bit late. We should have probably been doing this diversionary feeding 5 years ago on reflection, but there you go. Okay, we also put lots of camera traps in what are called racks. So this is in a forestry plantation. You can see where the hen Capercaillie there with a cock poult, a male poult in the foreground, and there's a female poult there as well. And that sort of line that goes up the middle is where the forestry machine is driven up and cut out a path for the harvesting machine to go down, and then his arm reaches into to the left and the right there to cut down trees and drag them out. So that's called the forestry rack. And from previous radio tracking work, we knew that cappers and their broods use these racks quite a lot because it's really warm area because the sun shines in the rack, and the racks have got more insects than the surrounding parts of the forests. So we thought we'll put cameras on racks and see what we get. So we got lots of pictures of foxes and martins and badgers at night commuting up and down these racks as well. We pictures of foxes carrying ducks, one fox with a squirrel, and that one with the capper poult that I showed you. So we did get some images of cappers going up and down these racks, but we didn't get that many. Still useful, but not that many. The dust baths were much more useful. So here's, now we're now into September. This was in 2021, so I don't know why the camera says 2020 there. He must have got the date wrong, but it's definitely 21. In September, and there's a female with 2 big male poults later on. So that's going to be the main way I think that Jack's going to try and measure the impact of diversionary feeding actually on Capercaillie. Okay, so the next wee bit, my final wee bit, is about raptors. So we're not only interested in mammals, we'd like to learn more about what the raptors are doing. So this photograph is not in the Cairngorms Connect area, but was taken by a guy called Dave Anderson that used to work for FLS, and he gave me a copy of this and said I could use it. And this illustrates the point that predators eat other predators. So you can see in that nest, there's a badger there. It's quite a big one, so maybe it was a roadkill, but eagles are known to take badgers. And you see some fox cub. There's at least one fox cub in that picture. So it's a good example of how a large apex avian predator will eat other predators. And now in the Cairngorms Connect area, I think we're up to 8 pairs of golden eagles now. So that's really quite exciting. So they must be having a bit of an impact on some of these other predators. Another predator that's returned to the Cairngorms Connect area and over the last 10 years in particular is the goshawk. So I think we're now up to, could be 10 pairs, I'm not sure, I need to check that. 8 to 10 pairs, I think, are now nesting throughout the forest. And they're a spectacular bird, obviously, but it's well known in Scandinavia that they specialise in woodland grouse like Capercaillie and black grouse. So there was some discussion about what these guys are going to be eating now they've pitched up in Cairngorms Connect area. Is this the sort of final nail in the coffin for woodland grouse, etc.? It was an area that we discussed quite a lot. It was interesting, they seemed to turn up on the back of jays, though. Jays colonised the forest. Well, firstly, I think it was 2009 I used to see them a lot, but then we had 2 big severe winters, didn't we, in the trot, and the jays seemed to disappear. But after that, they definitely became established and now quite abundant throughout the area. And the goshawks seem to colonise following on from the colonisation of jays. Maybe that was just coincidence, but they do eat jays. So how do you go about finding out what these birds are eating? Well, it's quite difficult. You can go and find the places like this plucking post where they take some of the prey and they pluck it, and you can look through the remains and try and figure out what they've been eating. Or you can climb up into their nests at the end of the season and take out all the prey remains and try and make something of it. And there's a wee lad called Justin Grant who does just that for us. So he's climbed into several of these goshawk nests in the Cairngorms Connect area, and he collects all this stuff that's piled up in the nest. He takes it home to his garage in all nests and spreads it out like this, and he goes through it and tries to enumerate what these things have been eating. It doesn't give you a comprehensive picture, but it gives you a feeling for some of the main big prey items for which the bones are likely to remain in the nest. So it's not an entirely reliable indication of their complete diet, but it does give you a feeling for the things they're eating. So here is a table showing you 3 territories of the same birds in 3 years. So it's quite a neat table. It's got pair A, pair B, and pair C across 3 years. We've got data before that as well. It's a bit messy though. So this table is nice and neat. So this gives you a feeling for the sort of things they're eating. You can see that, and I've totaled it on the left-hand side there for convenience. So the main things they're eating appear to be red grouse. So they're going out onto the moors from the forest to hunt red grouse. In fact, in one of the early nests, we had a ptarmigan. So they'd obviously gone up onto the plateau and got a ptarmigan and taken it back. They're eating lots of pigeons. They're eating some jays. And bear in mind, jays are nest predators of Capercaillie, so that in itself is interesting. There's evidence of eating other raptors like sparrowhawks and owls, but not very many. And quite a lot of squirrels they're eating. But we have not found a single Capercaillie in any of the nests. We did find one black grouse in 2018, I think, in one of the nests, but we've no evidence they're eating Capercaillie. So it's conceivable that the return of goshawks could be a net benefit for species like Capercaillie, because they don't seem to eat the Capercaillie, but they seem to eat things like jay that do eat Capercaillie nests. So again, it's an example of the complexity of it all, and this is what we're trying to get to the bottom of. But like all this research, the more you do, the more questions it raises. So we're really just scratching the surface. We're raising almost as many questions as we're answering as we go. But I hope you'll agree it's quite interesting. And we're always looking for volunteers to get involved. It really is an open door. Anybody can get involved in it. Nobody really owns the project. It's a group of enthusiasts. If anybody wants to come along and get involved in any aspect of it, you're more than welcome to do so. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
And something that you think is quite simple and straightforward, actually, it's very complex and intriguing. And as you just finished off saying, the more you get into it, the more questions and the more intriguing it becomes. Any questions that people want to ask? Yes, Colin.
I've always wondered why, when you have a Capper leg, you count the cocks, whereas you only actually need one cock to fertilize 10 hens. Surely, if you're really looking for the long-term health of the population, it's the hens you should be counting, not the cocks. Why is that going to be the case?
That's absolutely correct, and I agree with you 100%. The problem is it's quite difficult to count the hens. The main difficulty is that there still are quite a number of leks, and we've got relatively few counters. So we tend to count the leks throughout a 3-week period. And the hens only attend the leks for a few days. So one year we got, I forget his name, a volunteer chap counted the lek at Annagach for 7 mornings straight. And what he found is that at what we thought would be the start of what's called hen week, the Germans call it hen weeks. So the number of hens over a space of 7 days went 3, 4, 5, 7, 10, 12, 5, 7, 4, 2. So there's really pronounced period where the hens come in, they get mated, and then away they go, they don't come back. So being on the lek the morning there's that peak count of hens is impossible for us to guarantee. So most of the leks we count are somewhere else on that spectrum, even out with it. So you don't have the resources to count hens effectively, whereas most of the cocks are there most mornings. So the cocks is a sort of index, and we've assumed a 1-to-1 sex ratio, which has been found from the sort of national study. But you're right, ideally you'd want to have somebody at each lek every morning during hen week to get the maximum count of hens. That would be a much more useful figure.
Anecdotally, in the woods around here, 3 years ago, you walking the dogs in the winter, you'd see a capper every month or so. And in the last year, I got quite excited. I saw a cock capper twice the last month, but that's the first time for 18 months. So it's just anecdotal, but you do wonder if something's happened.
Well, I spent 10 years working exclusively on Capercaillie and got to know lots of people all over Scotland. And it turned out that all the anecdotes you got from these guys about their feeling about what was going on turned out to be absolutely right. So if you go and meet a keeper in Strathdon, for example, and he'd say, oh, the cappers are done for, I'm not seeing them anymore. And, when you start doing proper counts, you find out they're absolutely spot on. So this feeling that you're getting, I would put a lot of faith in that because it's usually pretty spot on in my experience.
Keith.
Thanks. You've told us about the increase in badger numbers. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've said that we think the badger population is increasing. We haven't really gone and counted them in any sort of systematic way. That's the next thing we're thinking of doing. I know that Ewan at Seafield has been doing a really good job of mapping the sets, which is quite an amazing map now. So, I've had somebody working for me on this project. I get them to go and census badgers. So that's the first thing to say. We haven't counted them properly, but everybody's been telling me they're increasing. We've gone and put out, we've done thousands of nights of camera trapping, and there's thousands of pictures of badgers. So it's not unreasonable to assume they are definitely increasing. So what is the reason for that? Well, I think part of it is there's been changes in snaring legislation. So fewer snares are put out now. It's much more stringently controlled. Folk are a lot more canny about what they do with snares. I don't think farmers snare like they used to. And if you go back to the 70s, there was probably a lot of control of a lot of animals going on all over the place. It was just part of the rural Scotland, wasn't it? So a lot of that is relaxed now. The legislation's changed. People are, there's lots of people out looking. So if you're going to do something that you shouldn't be doing, you probably think twice about it now. It's probably got a bit milder for the badgers. A whole range of things is happening simultaneously, and the evidence is pointing towards a huge increase in badgers. Yeah, which, I mean, ecologically, if you're an ecologist, it's quite interesting, and there are implications for it.
In a series of mild winters too, badgers are surviving. There's very little winter mortality, so they're surviving winter, which is decent population.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know much about badgers. Not really worked on them before, but we're thinking of maybe tagging some of them to see what they get up to get some definitive information on what they're up to. So apparently they're easy to catch, obviously, and you can tag them. So we're looking into that.
Yeah. Okay, Alan.
As many people here will know, we run a badger hide near Bottle Garden. And one of the things we do is every night in the logbook, we write down the most badgers that we saw simultaneously that night. And at the end of the season, we add that all up, divide by the number of visits, and that gives you an average per night of sightings for that year. And we've got 20 years of that. So you can draw a nice simple graph, which if I begin at the year 2001, let's say the figure is 2. And then it dropped down a little bit. And then from the middle of the noughties, it began to rise. And there was a steady rise up to and including last year. So, okay, that's what we did. We think that it's a reasonable guess that that's a reflection of the local badger population. So in my opinion, they probably are increasing in number. I'm expecting there to be a drop this year because we are not seeing on individual nights the large numbers that we had seen, say, in the last year. For example, in October last year, we had 2 nights where we had 11 badgers in view at one point. We have nothing like that this year. And I suspect the severe winter that we've just had may well be the reason for that. Yeah. It may not, but that's just a wild guess. I'll just throw that out there for interest. On the subject of snares, one of our badgers has a snare around its neck and has so for 2.5 years. We tried to catch it initially, failed, thought it had died. It didn't, it came back. We've left it alone and it's doing fine. We have never tried to identify individual badgers or give them names. This is an exception. The snare now is just down its neck with the sort of eye under its throat. It looks for all the world like a necklace, so we call it Bling.
Bling the badger. There you go. That's a children's storybook character.
Yeah, that's a really useful graph you're talking about. I feel a bit silly for not thinking to ask you, Alan, about that.
Yeah, happy to say.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And it does seem that the anecdotal evidence, and that's more constructed evidence, so is all pointing in the same direction, isn't it? Other questions? Yes.
Going back to Capercaillie, how many years is Jack doing field work to look at the diversionary feeding? And do you think at the end of that period, you might have a big enough sample to say that it has an effect on the wild Capercaillie breeding success?
He's going to do 2 more field seasons, so you have 3 field seasons in total. I'm a bit sceptical whether we'll be able to say anything definitive about the impact on Capercaillie because of a lack of sample size. I'm more optimistic now about the camera trapping than I was at the beginning because he has got some really nice pictures. It does work. It's just there's few birds about. We'll be able to say something definitive about the impact on artificial nests, obviously, and then you might be able to, on that basis, decide it's worth rolling out a bit more widely. But I've got a sneaking feeling we might not be able to say anything definitive about the benefits of Capper for low sample size.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Given that you found that foxes were eating dog poo and their DNA was turning up, and you found pine marten in hold on, what I was going to ask was, do you think that foxes eat pine marten poo, and the DNA that you were getting in the fox poo could have been from pine marten poo rather than alive?
Yeah, it could have been. We can't rule that out. That's the problem with these techniques. That it gives you all these tantalizing suggestions. We're pretty certain about the dog poo thing because it's so prevalent, and it's right throughout the study area, and we're 100% sure almost that it's dog poo they're eating. The question about could it be marten poo the foxes are eating? Potentially, and that's why it's turning up in the DNA analysis of fox scats. However, foxes killing and sometimes eating martens is known from elsewhere, so it could be either. It's a good question, Frank. It's one of the weaknesses of these methods is that it's sort of circumstantial evidence. You're not 100% sure how that DNA got in there.
Perhaps we should put Mars bars out as diversionary feeding for them.
That would probably work, yeah.
I just wonder just about the diversionary feeding. I mean, is that seen? I mean, if one of the objectives here is to try and find what's the balance in nature and between the various species of the prey and the predators, is the diversionary feeding not sort of human intervention that's distorting?
Yeah. I mean,
is that an issue or not? I mean,
well, it's a philosophical question almost, isn't it? So we're subjectively choosing to try and do something to save Capercaillie because we all like them.
Right.
It's a real treat to see one in the forest. Humans relate to big animals more. There's a perception bias that we like big things because they're more like us. We're less interested in the small animals. Sure. So you could say that, you know, Cairngorms Connect, the habitat's being enhanced, the biodiversity is increasing rapidly, but it's mainly the small taxa, the small species that people aren't that interested in.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people invested in Capercaillie, including myself and a lot of people in this audience. It'd be a real tragedy to see them go. So we're giving it a final go.
But is it reasonable to say that you're trying to protect the Capercaillie without, I mean, the simplest way would be just to shoot the foxes and the pine martens, or is that too simplistic? But you're
might have some support in the audience.
No, you're trying to come up with arrangements that don't actually harm other species.
Well, that's
so
part of the motivation, yeah.
So diversionary food is acceptable, whereas shooting the fox isn't. You know, is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Oversimplistic?
No, not really. I mean, there's no doubt that if you go back to 50 years ago or plus, when predator control was comprehensively done throughout the landscape of large parts of Scotland, it benefited grouse species. Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt about that. Tons of scientific evidence says that predator control benefits grouse species, but the sort of social environment has changed a lot, and now in a place like Cairngorms Connect, to carry out predator removal on a scale that would be really beneficial for Capercaillie would probably be ethically questionable for a lot of people. It would certainly be practically difficult. And you know, as many people like martens as like Capercaillie. So what the right answer is, I don't know. But
just the other, now, sorry, I just will hog it for another moment longer. But one of the other assertions we often hear, isn't it, is that human interventions or human behaviours, are going to affect the Capercaillie. So the dog walking in the forest, that's going to drive Capercaillies. But your research seemed to suggest there was very limited Capercaillie mortality due to dogs. Is that and if also you got in Glenmore quite extensive Capercaillie, when that's probably one of the most heavily populated dog walking woods around. Is there kind of the relationship between us and Capercaillie?
Well, I didn't talk about disturbance in Capercaillie tonight because I thought there might be a few dog walkers in the audience, and I had enough to talk about. But there's absolutely no doubt that currently Capercaillie are distributed in places like Glenmore to avoid people. So has anybody heard of Strava? It's a watch system where you can record where you go. Well, we got in touch with Strava, and they gave us their data for the FLS ownership down at Glenmore, and they give us this amazing online map that basically shows in bright lines where people go recreating. So all the main routes in Glenmore have really bright lights, because everybody's cycling up and down there with their Strava watches, and they put it online and show off how far they've cycled and all that. And then there's lots of thin lines through the forest where fewer people go. And there's a few lines where it's very thin. There's a few guys going, or girls, sorry, running, the extreme runners and all that. So this amazing map. And when we superimpose that map on where we knew the cappers remained, they were a perfect match. Basically, the few places that cappers remained were the only places that didn't have these bright lines in them. It's amazing, amazing match. And these areas where the cappers were tended to be either flat and boggy, so they weren't attractive to people, or they were very steep and rocky with trees, and people tended not to go there. But people definitely, the thing is though, the main problem with cappers appears to be that they're breeding poorly, much more poorly now than they did 30 years ago. If we could improve that, and we've all been trying for decades to improve their productivity and not really succeeded, they'll start producing more chicks. And then these younger subdominant animals would be forced to live close to tracks, etc.
Yeah.
Currently areas they're avoiding because the population's at low density. Because if you go back 30, 40 years to the Strath, there was cappers everywhere. And so the subdominant animals will live near tracks, etc., because they have no choice. Whereas now there's so few birds, they can choose to concentrate in the quieter areas, which they no doubt prefer.
Okay, good. Yeah, okay.
I can, given that one of your first diagrams showed lynx and wolves at the top, and if they were back here, they might sort of balance out the sort of meso predators. Do you think we've got enough time to hold on to the Capercaillie we've got before someone, maybe Cairngorms Connect, would see the vision of these predators arriving? So it's all very well increasing all the woods, etc. But if we're not taking the Capercaillie with us, it won't matter about the balance being there in 20 years' time.
Yeah.
So do you feel that there should be some intervention to hold on to the Capercaillie that we've got?
Did everyone hear that first? Just because it was about the reintroduction of wolves and lynx, if that was going to balance out.
The first thing to say, I wasn't advocating the reintroduction of wolves and lynx. The Scottish government are quite clear they don't have a policy on that, and if somebody comes forward with a licence application, they'll look for it. So that's the official spiel there. I can get in big trouble for advocating that as a civil servant. So I wasn't doing that. I was just merely pointing out the importance of predators, and research is indicating they're more influential. I don't think anything's going to happen on a time scale like that is going to be relevant to the current capper situation. No, absolutely not. And in fact, it's not guaranteed that if you brought these animals back, they would have that desired effect. So a lot of the rewilding community talk about these sorts of impacts, and I describe them today, but they talk about them in a slightly naive way. There's a huge amount of uncertainty around it. Often they quote Yellowstone and what happened there and the return of wolves, and everything was amazing. And now the guys working at Yellowstone are saying, well, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. The bears were increasing at that time. This was increasing. So it wasn't just wolves. And the sort of emerging thinking amongst all the people who are studying this is that, especially in really man-made landscapes like this, if you bring back a top predator, the influence of man is probably far greater than anything a few wolves or lynx could ever do. So in these man-made landscapes, it's far from certain that bringing them back would have the effect that the sort of rewilding communities seem to assume would definitely happen.
Yeah.
Okay. Being as you sort of identified that there definitely are fewer capper and they're struggling, is there a danger now that there could be a DNA bottleneck? And if that's the case, is a reintroduction of some sort maybe the only answer?
Okay, well, the first part of the question about inbreeding, so there's lots of talk about that. And that, I mean, has been as long as, Frank and I are on the National Capper Group, and we've been talking about that for 20 plus years. But in birds, as I understand it, I'm not a geneticist, but if a bird species becomes inbred and suffers from this inbreeding depression, as it's called, they're genetically not very variable, that usually manifests as low hatchability in the eggs. That's the usual symptom in bird populations. Well, there's no evidence for that in the current population, as far as I can see. I mean, we saw a brood there of 8 tonight. We've got other pictures like that. But I don't know. I don't know definitively. I just don't know of any evidence that says that they are inbred to the degree that would have an impact on things like that. It's not to say that they're not genetically less diverse than comparable populations elsewhere, like in Scandinavia, because we know for a fact they are. We did a study in 2004, I think, that showed that. And as the population shrinks and become more and more isolated, you know, maybe locally there might be some genetic issues. In terms of a reintroduction, there's a lot of talk about that as well. I think the National Park Authority, some individuals in there are pretty keen on it. The trouble is, if you take birds back and release them, they're going to encounter the same problem. So you need to think about that quite carefully. The technicalities of doing that are also quite difficult. So there's been tons and tons, I mean, literally hundreds of attempts to reintroduce cappers in parts of Central Europe, and they've all failed. What happens is they breed birds or they translocate them and let them go, and they all die pretty quickly because they don't know the area. They're eaten by abundant predators, etc. One attempt has been successful recently in Poland. And in fact, I was lucky enough to go to a conference there a few years ago. And it's amazing what they're doing. They've got these vast aviaries, I mean, bigger than this. And they get wild birds from Scandinavia. They hardly ever see a person. They put the mated hens into these cages that are kind of semi-natural with lots of cover. And the chicks hatch and they forage around in this natural habitat. They control all the predators, goshawks as well. I mean, they're huge live capture traps. And I said, what, you catch the goshawks and you translocate him? The guy went, yeah, as if to say, yeah, that'll be right. So, you know, they're going to an extreme effort, and then they open the door and the hen's allowed to go out with her chicks. And what happens is she takes the chicks out into the forest and then they come back at night into the aviary. And progressively they wander further and further, and then after a couple of months they stop coming back to the aviary. And they've had really great success doing it that way. It's called Born to be Wild or something. You'll find it online. But it's really expensive. It's a vast effort. And you know, if somebody wants to pay me to do it, I'll give it a go. But it's a huge investment.
It's in Poland, to the Roland area in Poland.
Yeah.
And I've got it here. So
Yeah. It's a vast forest as well.
Yeah, they seem to be successful in what they're doing anyway.
Yeah.
It started off, I believe, with fairly low numbers in capper.
Yeah. It all started apparently, we were having a few beers over there, and there were some Finnish guys, and the Finnish guys were saying, oh, it all started because we met the Polish guys from the State Forestry Company at another conference, and they all got pretty boozy. And he said, right, you get some cappers and bring them over. So this Finnish guy said, I told him I could catch them, no bother. I'd never done it before. So he got this big fat contract, and away he went back to Finland. He got a couple of his mates, and they drove about the forest at high speed with one of them in the back of this pickup with a huge net. Early in the morning, when the hens were at roadside getting grit and everything, and the hens would kind of freeze as his car came around. And he said he would hang out he was all just trying it from scratch. And the hen would finally get up and start flying along the road, and they'd drive up beside it and he'd catch it in the net. It was Wild West stuff. Eventually they perfected it and got a load of them and took them to Poland with a few males, and away they went. But it's a vast investment.
That's it. Right about it.
Good ball. Peter.
One often hears crows mentioned as predators. Do you have any evidence on that?
In none of our camera traps really did we find a few photographs of crows at the artificial nests. I can't remember the results of the Abernethy. I'm pointing at Desmond because he was there at the time, of Ron Summers filming the nests. I can't remember if crows were recorded there.
First 2 or 3 years of the dummy nest experiment, crows were significant predators, but at the same time we were reducing the population of crows.
That's
so
right.
The latter half of that nest experiment, dummy eggs, it changed from being corvids to mammals.
Yeah.
Time mark.
I think that's the situation now. The corvids have become proportionally less important as the mammals have become more abundant, I think. But, you know, they're traditionally known to be nest predators, that's for sure. I mean, I worked with red grouse in the past, and they were really efficient predators of red grouse nests. In fact, one year, I remember we did a study where we had to, I forget why, but we had to find the red grouse nests a lot. And we started off by putting canes next to the nests so we could find it. I think we were weighing the eggs over a period of time. And the crows immediately found out that a cane meant nest. So they just hoovered up all the nests. So they're pretty bright.
Yeah, Elaine.
In Scandinavia, the Capercaillie population stable there because they do have lynx and wolves, so they've got the top predators as well as the meson predators. Are their numbers stable or are they decreasing as well? Do we have any information about that?
I'm a bit out of touch with what's going on in Scandinavia now since I'm not working exclusively on them, but I think the population is in a slow decline. We've still got a lot more than we have, clearly, but I think it's in a slow decline. They do have some of these top predators, but they're very thin in the ground and only in certain parts of the country, and the impact of man is far greater than a few wolves and bears, I think. So it doesn't offer much encouragement or hope.
I was wondering whether the influence of man in Scandinavia is similar to what's happening in Scotland, where we've got, a lot of people out and about cycling, and one of them,
as am I, yeah.
Walking. Is that happening in Sweden and Norway and Finland?
In some parts, yeah. Throughout the area, it's a highly modified forest they have there. I think when I went to Norway once, the guy took us to the one remaining bit of primeval forest in Norway, and it was tiny. And then I realised, it's all influenced heavily by man. There's a lot of harvesting going on, tons of deer control, although the moose population is going up hugely, apparently. So it's highly modified. But I think in the park here, it's an exaggerated version of that. Everything here is so acute and so insane. The number of visitors since the advent of the park has gone from 1 million to 2 million, I believe. It's an incredible change in the short time I've been in the Strath, 20 years or something. People like Frank have been here a lot longer and seen bigger changes, I guess. So everything's really exaggerated in our landscape with tiny blocks of forest. So the Cappers we know for a fact, did well in a landscape where there was significant predator control that compensated for the fragmented nature of the habitat. The weather was also a bit better back then. We've got data to that effect.
Any more questions? Just one there and then a couple.
It's just in addition to that, actually, that in Norway and Sweden, I know the local government still offer bounties. So hunters can go into local government and produce carcasses of pine martens, badgers and lynx, and they're actually paid bounty to control these mesopredators.
Well, on a related topic, I sound like I've been on a million jollies. I haven't really, but I once went to Latvia and met the foresters there, and they had a similar situation. A Capercaillie were disappearing off a dike, like snow off a dike. And we said, "What's the main problem?" He said, "Oh well, since we became free of the Soviet Union, the market for pelts of martens and foxes has disappeared, so nobody's bothering anymore." Because formerly there was a lot of money to be made sending fleeces to Moscow or whatever. And so they stopped doing that, and foxes and martens increased, hugely. And they were pretty certain that was the cause, which is plausible.
Okay, yeah.
Looking at the graph and extrapolate it for the camper, what would you do to try and address that and try at least to get the graph leveling off a bit for the Capercaillie? Because at the moment it's a downward trend. If you were given the opportunity, what things would you say are...
I think there's one thing I've demonstrated in the last 25 years is that I don't know anything about Capercaillie. So I'd be the last person to put in charge of it. We gave it a good go in the noughties with that LIFE project, and we arrested the decline and it started improving for a while. We took down a load of fences, we did predator control. There were some nice summers for a few years, which was probably the most important thing. And the population stopped decreasing and increased for a while, but then it's just gone to pot since then. So I don't know, I've thought about it so much, I don't know. I'm afraid. Sorry, it's a very disappointing answer.
It's
from a
a bit of a
so-called-
gloomy, pessimistic sort of tone to finish.
Well, there's a whole new set of young people
Yeah.
working on it now. Maybe they'll
The
solve it.
optimists. Yeah.
Yeah, the optimists.
Just
Exactly.
a final thought from me. Wildcats haven't been mentioned at all tonight, have they? Is there? Is that because they're irrelevant, or is that because they're not? I mean, it's just.
Well, in all the camera trapping that we've done, and all the camera trapping that Scottish Wildcat Action have done in this area, there were very few cats. There were some on Capercaillie for a while, but the bad winters of a few years back seem to have done for quite a few of the cats. So they're very thin in the ground.
Yeah.
And FLS are partners in the new project called Saving Wildcats, and we've captured a load of cats in various places, including in an FLS place called Clashindarich, which is near Huntly, a big commercial plantation where there was quite a few good-looking cats remaining. But they're all poor hybrids, below 70% wildcat DNA.
Yeah.
So every cat that I've ever heard of or got genetic results about is a poor hybrid. So in the Strath here, we found very little evidence of cats, one or two here and there that look all right. But Saving Wildcats down at Kincraig are currently starting to breed them from the captive population, which is nearly 100% DNA wildcat. There's about 200 of them in the UK apparently. And they're using them and they're captive breeding them, and the plan is to release some in this area.
And will they then be a threat to the Capercaillie?
No, well, there was to do this sort of project, you have to satisfy nature, Scott, that it won't have a negative effect on the designated things like Capercaillie. We've done a huge assessment of that, and there's very little evidence of wildcats taking Capercaillie. For example, at Glentanner, when cappers were super abundant in the 70s, there was a big study of wildcats. There was no evidence they took any, which was surprised me, but that's what it
encouraging. Okay, that's a more positive note.
Sorry, it was all doom and gloom, was that?
No. It's actually been fascinating, isn't it? I mean, just by length and the variety of questions. So what a great evening, and I feel much more informed and intelligent about it now. So thank you very, very much for coming along. I'm just going away. Just a small.
Glad I came now.
A small token. Thank you very much. Fascinating and really good. So thank you so much for coming along. And thank you all for coming out and for asking such good, informed, intelligent questions. I mean, it has made it a really interesting evening. So excellent for that. Thank you. And just a final reminder, we're back again in a fortnight's time, 13th of December, for our last talk before the Christmas break. Scott Becker. So we're back into the mountains. Scott Becker is a TISO ambassador and is an extreme mountaineer in many regards. He holds the world record for climbing up the highest mountain and then jumping off the top. So that will be 4 days to climb up, half an hour to get down. So that, we're going to get some really fascinating and interesting and exciting images from Scott. So hopefully you and others can come along in a fortnight's time. But thanks for coming tonight. Thanks again, Kenny. It's been a great night. Thank you all. Stay calm.
The next talk sounds like it's worth a fiver.